All right, happy Friday, everyone. Today is Friday, and my name is Denver Noes, president of Wealth for Life. Today, we're going to go over the Modern Family Dynasty newsletter. We do this every Friday, and it'll get published on LinkedIn, in the LinkedIn group, also on YouTube. But today, we're going to go over this week's newsletter. 37 million Americans are caring for elderly parents. That's going to be one of the topics we talk about today. But first, before we jump in, I wanted to highlight the upcoming event that we have. And make sure that you subscribe to the newsletter. Again, there's a lot of good information in these past issues that come out. Last few times we talked about how to cut taxes by 50%. I know it's a big topic right now as people are kind of preparing in the last quarter. So make sure you subscribe to the newsletter. You can access all the back issues there as well. And also wanted to let you know that we do have an upcoming event, and that will be on October 26th. So this will be 5 secret strategies millionaires use to cut taxes by 50% and 5x their wealth, part 3. So the last 2 events we had a great turnout, over 1,200 attendees from those last 2 events. A lot of good information. So in this one, of course, we're going to review how to cut taxes by 50%, which is very important because taxes are a big drain on wealth. But then we're also going to go into a deeper dive on the wealth strategies that you can use to 5x wealth. And I'm always asked, do people do things differently when they're really wealthy? What are the 1% doing to make a lot of money? Yes, they are doing different things. They absolutely do different things. And when you see the income gains and the wealth gains from those in the top 1%, what you want to look at for yourself is like, are you participating in that? Is your wealth growing in that way? And if not, it's usually a systems problem. You don't have the right systems in place so you can capitalize on the opportunities, prevent the wealth drain from taxes on the other side. So we will go into that in the event. You can look it up on LinkedIn, or you can just go to 5xevent.com and that'll redirect you to the LinkedIn page and you can register there. So now let's kind of get into the topic, the first topic of the newsletter, which in the Learn section was, elderly parents and caring for elderly parents. So I took care of my mom, my dad, my grandma for about a 10-year period of time. They all got hit with health issues later on in life. And while I'm a wiser person for that, taking care of elderly parents and grandparents is certainly exhausting. It took a lot of collaboration, from myself and my family and even neighbors and everything else. And we'll kind of get into how difficult that can be. But so a lot of people aren't facing that yet, and they're going to be facing that, or you probably will if you haven't already experienced it. And so in the newsletter we talked about this week, Diane helped us out on, she has some great articles. She's a great resource. You can connect with her on LinkedIn. The link is in the newsletter, but about these quality of life metrics. And you kind of come up with these non-negotiable quality of life things that you want to make sure that are very important to your mom or your dad or your grandma, whoever you're taking care of. Those would be things like, for my mom, for example, it was like she needed to have coffee every morning with a certain flavor of cream, right? And then have her coffee throughout the day. So that's a non-negotiable. With my dad, there were times we had to make sure he could go outside every day because he actually had to go into a facility. Back to my mom's case, even my grandma's case, it was very important for them to be in the home. So we had to do things to modify the house to make sure that they could live there. So you start just kind of having these conversations about what are things that are really important to them, and then start building systems around that to make sure that can happen. Sometimes those systems are going to be financial systems. Obviously, that's a big one. How are you going to pay for all this, and who's paying for all this? And that is complicated. And that's something you don't want to wait till the last minute to do, because that's part of what happens when you start. You'll notice as you start getting into this process with the parents, the first very common phase is this denial phase that they don't, sometimes they don't want to talk about it. And they're in this denial phase that they don't really need any help. So you have to kind of really work through that, because what ends up happening is usually then the situations get made after a catastrophe happens. Somebody has a fall, they break the hip, and then now they're in a wheelchair, and now the home isn't work because the shower hasn't been fixed mid-ready, or the doors aren't wide enough. And so all of that can get really catastrophic. So you want to be able to start talking about these types of considerations first. And that really goes back to that 5 quality, the QOL, as Diane calls it, quality of life metrics, like what are going to be really important for them long term. And a lot of times you're going to hear the usual, well, when I get old, just put a bullet in my head. Some of them, my dad was very stubborn in that regard. And of course, it didn't work out that way because he had a lot of issues. He had to end up going into a facility. And just that process of trying to find a facility for him I can't tell you how many nursing homes that I went into in nice areas that I was like, oh my God, we're not putting someone in here. Like, you have to really go and investigate those types of facilities. And some of the tips I think in doing that are, my favorite is talk to physical therapists, because physical therapists, if you know, just find some, or if you know some, they're in those facilities all the time working with people. So they really get to see the ins and outs. That's very, very helpful. And then go there to check out the food, you know, and see how that is. I mean, all those things are always really difficult. So, and then when you start looking at levels of care, then you go back to quality of life metrics. If you can make it happen with the house, and they can stay in their own home, or they can live with you, or you can build a, you know, mother-in-law or father-in-law place on the back of your property, those things are great. And then take those steps to do that. Widen the doors. You know, you think about steps, and you think about wider bathrooms and easier access to toilets and bath and shower. And then we were even in a situation where my parents didn't have any assets. So we were kind of paying for the whole thing. And so then you're able to qualify for some state assistance. We were able to actually use that to have neighbors participate. Neighbors were able to come over across the street and next door to become caregivers, but actually get paid through state funding. So there are options like that. And all of that takes some really planning and work. And like, as Diane mentions in her book and articles, there's 1,000 little decisions that come up. So it's just always try and get ahead of that game. Now, the next level there, so you got those two levels. You have staying in the home, and you have nursing homes, high level skilled care. There's also the medium level, which is group homes. We're seeing, you know, kind of walk up there. And the group homes are, you know, where you have a nice home in a neighborhood. There might be 4 or 5 bedrooms in it. And sometimes there'll be 1 resident per bedroom. Sometimes there'll be 2. And those are a very much nicer environment, because it feels like there's a home. And very often the residents sit down for breakfast every morning, and in lunch and dinner together. And so it just has more of a really good homey type feel. Those are great options as well. And you can get higher levels of care in those. Obviously, it's going to cost more. And so that's why you have to start planning assets and how do you structure that. So when you're doing that process, people often ask about, you know, hey, do we transfer assets out of my parents' names? How do we structure bank accounts, properties? All of that is a little bit complicated. And very often you have to work with an eldercare attorney on that, because if you're eventually going to try and get state assistance, you're going to have to, there's a look back period that Medicare has where they will look back and see, have you transferred assets, or even the state Medicaid systems, have you transferred assets out in a certain period of time? So that financial side does, you know, require some work, and also on the financial planning side. So there's a lot of resources out there to help do it, but it's just, if I can stress it, I can't stress it enough. It's something you want to get ahead of and really start doing before the catastrophes hits, having the conversations, getting your parents to talk about their assets. A lot of parents are very private. You know, I've even talked with some parents that are elderly people in those age groups, and they're like, my kids have no idea how much money I have. You know, you got to get those conversations going, because it doesn't end well when you don't. And so if you have questions, if you want to reach out on resources you can use, if you're going through that, connect with me, connect with people like Diane. I'm happy to review finances for you, give you some ideas, because that it is something that for parents, it has to be planned for. Because if it hits where all of a sudden, and my mom's issue was was in a car accident and ended up having lost a portion of her leg from that accident. So now all of a sudden you have someone who was super healthy and doing really well, and boom, there's a catastrophe. And now you need skilled nursing care, you know, every day, because she needs help, you know, bathing, toileting, and all those other things. And, or my dad, you know, you have a big catastrophic issue, and then all of a sudden, boom, now you have this care that is now $5,000 a month or $8,000 a month. So you got to get the systems in place to handle that. All right, so from there, so that was our learn section. Check out the newsletter. And then now we'll kind of get into the next area, which is my chart section. And let me zoom the screen a little bit. So this is you know, when you look at the US debt, that's the top line right there, the orange one. The US has borrowed more in the last year than just about every other country in the world combined. And if you compare that to the chart on the left, that was the public debt in 1995. Certainly, we always had more, but the numbers that we've done this year on the amount of, in the last few years on borrowing is pretty big compared to the rest of the world. And I think part of the issue there that people are worried about is then when you look at, the spotlight here on how much of that debt needs to be refinanced. About half of that needs to be refinanced by 2025 for the United States. So a lot of that debt was created in a lower interest rate environment. Now interest rates are higher, so a lot of that debt's going to have to be refinanced higher, which is, of course, going to increase the amount of interest that the federal government owes on its debt. And a lot of times when people are looking at, well, what does this really mean? The only thing I would say to this is like the previous slide showed, but while we are borrowing more, the whole world is going in debt. So the whole world is everyone's on this debt train of borrowing more and more and more. So it's not that we're alone in this. And, it's not like some other countries are way more financially sound than the United States. We are still by far the most financially sound country in the world. Yes, we have more debt. It's a big debate now. Does the debt matter or does it not matter? Certain economists, as you know, people are saying, no, it doesn't matter. There's other ones saying, yes, it does. The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. When you have a lot of revenue, like the federal, the United States does, we generate, a big number, GDP every year. Well, we can carry debt. That's not a problem because we have revenue. But obviously there's levels where it gets, out of control. So what the more issue is it just adds another thing to the uncertainty of the markets. How are the markets going to react when all this debt has to be refinanced? The outlook for bonds may be better. Does that mean the outlook for equities are worse? And that's certainly something that we'll talk about in the webinar that'll be coming up. It's going back to these frameworks where most people they're in this situation where their entire retirement plan, or what I call the one thing retirement plan, is based on what happens in stocks and bonds. And it doesn't feel safe, because you just don't have any control there. You can work your whole life, save all your money, diligently come up, and then you just hit a bad sequence where the market decides to go crappy for the next 5 years, and that hammers your retirement down, or 10 years. And so that's why it's just having different systems in place where you have offensive and defensive assets. You break assets down into different areas. So defense, no matter what happens in the world, you have money coming in. This frees up your capital to take advantage of more opportunities, and so you can be offensive without all the stress. And if you kind of look at the gains, like I mentioned before, the top 1%, and what how their wealth is continuing to grow, if you're not participating in that, that's because you don't have the right systems in place. And that's not necessarily your fault. It's because much of conventional wisdom for the 99% of advice you're going to get is just invest in the stock market. Yet when we look at the assets for the top 1% and how they do that, stock markets usually are their smallest assets compared to certainly real estate, businesses, and other types of assets. So we'll go into that a little more, but it's really when you start thinking about the U.S. government debt and all the spending and all the interest that's going to go up, you start thinking about, well, I need to have my assets more segmented in offense and defense, so anything that happens in the world doesn't wipe me out. But more importantly, you don't get stuck in the doom and gloom of just like, I need to put all my money in the mattress and hide because the whole thing's going to blow up. You want to have your system structured to where you have defense protection, but then you have dry powder and money in offense that you can redirect, because there's always going to be money to make. There's always money to be made in the economy. It's just if you're able to capitalize on it. So that was our section on, I kind of covered two of them in this week. We covered the chart with the debt, and then this one, which was the concept of the week. In the newsletter, there's actually a video where I go into breaking down offense and defense and how that's structured a little more. So check that out, and certainly let me know if you have any questions. And then from there, we went into, this is the video. You can access that on YouTube, or you can access that on the LinkedIn in the newsletter version of that. And lastly, I always do kind of a productivity tip. This is my favorite device. I've had this for over a year or two now. It's called the Expand a Lung, and it's a breathing exerciser. And of course, the headline I have in the newsletter is, 300% more endurance without exercise. And there's actually a ton of data on that. If you go to Expand a Lung, the link is in the newsletter. You'll see all the data they have on how athletes use that. So basically, exercises your lungs, increases VO2 max, gives your body the basic ability to, to have more oxygen and stuff as you're running. And even just for me, it's so easy to use. You just put it in your mouth, you blow in and out 5 minutes, you can turn the dial, creates resistance, and you do it a few times a week, 2 to 3 times a week, 5 to 7 minutes, sitting at your desk or, doing it at night or whenever you want to do it. And number one, breathing, of course, is good for you. It's relaxing, but it also is just creating this resistance. And so I noticed it in a big way when we were up in the mountains at my cabin up there for the summer, a couple months up there, and hiking around. I mean, my endurance, I definitely felt the difference. And of course, blood pressure goes down, endurance goes up. It's a good little device for $30, and pretty much anyone can do it as well. So, but when you read the science that they have on their site, that's Expand Along, or you can buy it on Amazon for $30. It's a phenomenal device, easy to access, easy to use. All right, so that was the recap for this week. And make sure you register for the event that we have coming up, 5xevent.com. We'll go into a deeper dive on asset structures, of course, review tax strategies on how to cut taxes by 50% for the year. So I do appreciate everyone and all the comments I get. And thanks to everyone for checking out the newsletter. My name is Dan Vernos with Wealth for Life, and I'll talk to you again soon.